Awesome. So this is titled Binary Transformation from Knitting to Coding. I'm Genevieve Krzeminski, your host today. Please be sure to share your experiences all week and today with the hashtags Den Startup Week, and I created one, Knitting to Coding. So please use that. Thank you. Awesome. So I wanted to start out with a little clarification for those of you who may not be as familiar with knitting about what it is by telling you what it is not. So it is not crochet. We'll talk a little bit more about some differences later. It's also not needlepoint, cross stitch, embroidery, or chopsticks. So yeah, it's you use needles, not usually this large and awkward, but you can, and I have a lot of these. Can you hear me okay in the back? I'm a pretty loud talker, but I'll work hard talking to this mic. Yeah, so you use needles like this. Crochet is used with a hook. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I just wanted to call that out. Great. So who knits? Well, it's not just for grandmas, although that's where people's minds usually go. In fact, in 2016, the numbers from 28.8 million Americans were knitters or crocheters. I found it really interesting that while 18% consider themselves experts, which is pretty high, that is a good number, 82% think they're beginner or intermediate skills. So that might be important later. The age ranges kind of all over the board. So again, not just grandmas. And something we'll talk a little bit more about later is this last stat here about 71% being female. Quick poll of audience though, who here knits or crochets? Take either, awesome. And who here codes, does the programming stuff? Yes, awesome, a larger portion, great. That's what I anticipated. And who here does neither? Awesome. That's very exciting. I will try to give you lots of information on both, depending on your level, but if you're totally lost, please shout out questions anytime. All right. So why am I talking to you about knitting and coding today? Well, I have a lot of experience in both. In fact, I've been doing both for over 15 years, and I am really excited to tell you about how they are similar, tell you a little bit more about some of the similarities, and this is going to be a bit of a framework that I'm going to walk through to tell you about that. But there's a lot to gain by understanding the crossover and the intersection between them, and I hope that it will help open up your brain a little bit to understanding how to branch out into other things. So, this is not the first time that knitting and coding have met this presentation. In fact, going back to World War II, the Belgian Renaissance, knitting was used to track logistics of their enemies by secret spies, often women, who were dropping or purling stitches to indicate different passing trains. But non-spy knitters also have knit up code, Morse code, binary programming languages, Dewey Decimal System as an example. Very, very fascinating stuff. So I really liked that. One particular story was about Phyllis Doyle. She was a spy who used her knitting to hide codes because as a woman, she was less suspected to be spying. I thought that was really cool. Was it a coincidence that her code name was Genevieve? German. So like I said, I've been doing both for more than 15 years. Currently, I'm a senior engineering manager for Quizlet. Quizlet is focused on helping people study and master whatever they're trying to learn. I was really drawn to Quizlet's mission because I really care about lifelong learning and teaching. I think I was really inspired by my mom, who was a teacher, and have teachers in my family, and I really like helping people learn. I actually knew I wanted to work with computers from a young age. These images are from a book I wrote when I was 10. Super exciting. So I wanted to be a teacher someday, and I knew I wanted to work with computers. My dad worked with computers, and I think, and it sounds funny saying that because now they're so ubiquitous. People are like, yeah, of course, but yes, there was a time before it was so ubiquitous. And so my mom taught me to crochet, and that I also got into a lot of those other fiber arts that I mentioned. but then knitting. So actually in college, it wasn't until college when my best friend saw a girl knitting on the train and said, we need to learn this. So we taught ourselves, and it was, again, prior to YouTube videos of how to do it. So I'm a self-taught knitter, and I had to work out of books with very crappy diagrams like this that made it very difficult to understand what to do. So we saw this girl knitting on the train, we taught ourselves to knit, and then it progressed from there. I moved later to be near a local yarn shop, abbreviated LYS for those, so there's knitting lingo codes and acronyms as well. I entered a hat contest actually. This is not a picture of the hat of the contest, but it was one that was fun. It was taken in that shop. So I won the hat contest, and the owner asked me, do you want to teach knitting? And I was like, sure. So I started teaching knitting then, and I've been doing it ever since. I started my own business about 7 years ago. So yay, startup representation, startup week, called Astraknots.com. And I'll talk a little more about it later, but essentially it's a website with how-to knitting videos. They're all very short and clear and all the basic steps, so really fun, and I kind of built that several iterations. So I got to be a teacher after all, right? Because I'm teaching knitting, and as a manager, I'm going to do lots of coaching. So those things are really fun. So at first blush, it does not appear that these things have anything in common. You know, we've got the sweaters and different tools and output going on from here. These are very hands-on. They're both very hands-on, okay, jumping into the similarities, but we have keyboards and very, computers and things, but they're, the end user is maybe a similar person, whether they're the end user of your software or the end user who's wearing a hat or a scarf, things like this. Another thing kind of in common too is human implementers, and that pool is all of us here today. So I'm really hoping to dig into this today and show you how these two different worlds collide more. And I'm also going to encourage you to follow a Quizlet value, which is to teach yourself something new as well. So let's jump in. Note about binary action. They both have binary operations. So at its core, knitting is binary. The zeros and ones represented by knits and purls. Computers operate in binary at their core, meaning they store data and perform calculations using only zeros and ones. So that is the very kind of top level trivial similarity, but we're going to dig in a little bit more. So breaking it down, again, I showed you this before, I'm really going to drill on this. This will be the framework. Ultimately, they both create a product from a specification or a pattern. And when I say both things, when I say coding, I'm really talking about like the software that's produced, is the product in coding. And knitting, this could be your hat or your scarf or whatever it is that you're making. How many of those are actively knitting right now? Yes, at least one. Love it. Very good for helping you focus. So both of these operations use very specific tools, as I mentioned, hands-on and varied tools. We'll talk more about that. And they're both building with an end user in mind. So somebody that the product is for. So that's very important. And they require specific configuration or skills with some barrier to entry. So not everyone did everything when I asked you in the beginning. There's probably a good reason for that, but we'll dig into that. Also, humans, like humans. Okay, so now we're going to really dive into that framework. I'm going to kind of break it down for you step by step. So this is like the meaty part. So the product, as I've been referencing, knitted products, are made from wool or other fibers, and generally the goal is to make something for someone to use, something cool, something to show off. And ditto with software, we're making something that does something cool that we want someone to use. So already we have something in common there. Just let's screenshot for you. And sometimes, the process is straightforward for this creation, and sometimes it's not. But there's a little level of like making improvements to people's lives and adding efficiency as well. That's the goal. So one underlying pattern that's a similarity between both is patterns, actually. So in code, traditional computer science instruction teaches you about design patterns, and they have all sorts of fun names. You don't need to read all of them on here. And there's different books, but this is a pretty common foundational thing in the world of coding, is to follow these patterns or building blocks to how you're going to construct your code. Similarly, in knitting patterns, we have basic building blocks, which are predetermined segments of knitting code that describe what you're knitting, how to construct it in order to reach the end product that you're trying to produce. So in fact, when writing a pattern, I believe knitting pattern designers must bear similar things in mind to programmers writing a computer program. So kind of like think about that for a moment. There is a lot that goes into constructing these patterns and forming, thinking ahead of time, like what we're going to build. Yes, you can just cast on and start knitting something, but usually you have an idea in mind of where you're going. Similarly, with writing a coding program, there's these basic guidelines that you follow for how it is constructed and assembled. So this little text-heavy slide, we'll kind of walk through a little bit of it, just a little more in-depth, side by side. So code design patterns kind of fall into these three classes. We have creational, structural, and behavioral. So creational are all about, in coding lingo, class instantiation or object creation. Some coders in the room are a little more familiar with that. But in knitting, I would kind of map that to cast-on methods, which is how you start knitting. There's different ways to approach knitted items called bottom-up or top-down. In a hat, you can knit from the brim up or from the top down. Okay, so translating that for the non-coders in the room, class instantiation or object creation, patterns that are how do you create new code things. Okay, and then we're going to dive a little more into like structural and behavioral as well. So one example of structural patterns, which are aimed to organize the form or structures to provide functionality. Okay, so I have this example about microservices versus monoliths. So that's code lingo for you, and then sweater construction is the knitting lingo. So we'll do a little translation here. So if you're familiar with coding, there's a really popular approach to how you structure your entire software architecture, which is called microservices. I'm sure you've heard a lot about microservices if you're in the coding world. And what microservices are trying to solve is this very large centralized code base not being easy to scale or having other issues, and they want to break it apart and make different parts easier to build separately and work together. And microservices are the approach to doing that. So I found this very similar to how we consider building a sweater without knitting. So in the monolithic sweater, there's a sweater construction called Raglan, and it's knitted top-down. So again, that's that design. The design pattern knitting is the top-down version. It's all in one piece. So similar to coding a monolithic code base where everything can immediately talk to everything else, it's all in one piece. With this, there's no assembly required, but it kind of gives you limited decisions about how you construct it. And similarly with monolithic code bases, there's some limitations that have led people to want to use microservices. So I kind of said microservices sweater is another approach to knitting a sweater where you knit it in pieces and then seam those together. So you sew the different pieces together, gives you a little more options in terms of that structure, but it's a little more effort and you have to be thoughtful with your assembly. Similarly, in the coding world, when constructing your software and microservices, you have to take more care to connect the different pieces of microservice architecture together, having the API contract that helps them communicate and all of that. So think about these two different ways. Check in real quick. How is this making sense? No, it's okay. Yes, cool, awesome. At least half the people. So what I call behavioral pattern, which definition code-wise, assignment of responsibilities between objects or encapsulating behavior. To me, this knitting-wise really spoke to this right versus left-handedness. So here's another little binary thing. There's two kinds of knitting techniques generally. One is called English or American, but really it's the throw method to demonstrate while holding this, where you wrap the yarn with your right hand, and there's the continental method, where you wrap the yarn with your left hand. So although knitting uses both hands, just like coding, there are two different techniques to that. However, ultimately, the end product that you produce in knitting is the same, regardless of which hand you use. Coding is obviously a two-handed gig. Unless you're really good at one-handed typing, sometimes it comes in handy. But I consider this sort of a behavioral pattern translated to knitting. All right, now let's dive into the tools. So I've kind of indicated some of them about the tools, and we're going to talk about how there are very specific tools for both coding and knitting, and kind of how there's a little bit of a mapping between them. So in coding, you need a programming language usually to develop a piece of software. And just as it's important to choose the right programming language that's going to ultimately result in whatever software you're trying to produce, and there's different strengths, similarly in knitting, there's lots of different kinds of yarn. So we really enjoy, knitters really enjoy yarn. Really excited about it. So considerations in coding, right? We're considering the technological fit of our programming language, maybe what already exists in the environment, whether or not you're developing for the mobile or web applications. You know, here's this example about Node.js, which is kind of running server-side runtime, versus Angular, which is more of a client-side MVC framework. Okay, all the knitters are like, yeah, that's a bunch of words. But the coders know what I'm talking about. So, you know, trying to bridge the gap there and thinking about considerations of yarn you may not have thought about before. The thickness, I mean, yes, color, but the fiber content. Is it wool? Is it alpaca? Is it acrylic? That's an example. The fiber content. And we also have to consider that when determining what we're making in a knitted piece and how big it is. You could make a pair of socks out of really thick, fuzzy yarn, but you might not be able to fit the socks in your shoes. So again, that's a translation of what I said here about the coding bit. You may not choose, you know, if you have limitations of your hardware, you might choose a language that's more performant, or maybe your company only employs Java developers and it's really hard to hire people who only know Ruby. So that is another consideration about programming language and building that. All right, so once you've chosen your programming language in coding, then you might also consider the framework or libraries that you're going to use and different aspects of them. This is kind of closely related here. Whether or not it's open source versus proprietary, what the source or community support looks like for that language, what existing libraries there are. Considerations that go into choosing that and building product or software with these tools. When building something for knitting, most often knitters are going to use an existing pattern that they may slightly modify for their own use, but it's a lot easier to use an existing one than coming up with your own. And there's lots of different kinds of patterns. There's read, made, whether or not where it comes from. I'll talk more about this later, but I teach a whole class on how to read patterns in knitting and how to pick them based on where they come from. Because they have lots of errors and stuff. I'll talk more about that. So I think these parts of the tools kind of map together. Then finally, we had to have this, what the code runs on, right? So you have your hardware, maybe it's cloud supported, and then you have some supporting tools. These things aren't trivial, we need them, the keyboard, mouse, monitors, servers, all of that infrastructure. Similarly, knitting has that. What you knit on, again, needles, which I told you about these things. There's also a bunch of supporting materials for knitting, stitch markers and scissors and a bunch of other needle types that are helpful tools that help knitters knit successfully. But finally, we have the human implementer. In both cases, it comes down to a human. Code mostly doesn't write itself. And knitting doesn't knit itself, even by machine. Even knitting machines need a human. So I think it kind of boils down to this formula that I created here. Software products are your language, plus your framework, your hardware, and the coder. And the knitting product is yarn, plus needles, pattern, and a knitter. And then we get that product, the tools. And being trained to use these specific tools and work with the specific configurations is non-trivial. So that's worth calling out. Like, it's kind of a lot I just dumped on you there to absorb and think about. There's a lot of different considerations that kind of go into either of these in acquiring those necessary skills and tools to create the different things. All right, so now we're going to talk about how you build stuff out of all of that. That's cool. So I'm going to give you a little knitting rundown in terms of how to build things. There's a thing called a gauge swatch in knitting. And for those of you who don't know, even who have experience with knitting, I teach knitting, so I'll tell you about the gauge. The gauge is made of 3 parts. Things we've already talked about: the yarn, the needles, and you. And the reason it gauges, another word for it is the tension, but ultimately the reason you knit one of these things is to determine if what you're making is going to fit. So if I'm making a hat or a sweater for somebody or myself, I want to make sure that thing fits. I once finished a sweater for somebody and they had completely different tension than me. I was a much looser knitter, they were much tighter, and the sweater turned out ginormous. It was so big, I had to rip the whole thing out. It was really miserable. But, so gauge is very important. There's some things you can get away with, like scarves and coasters, where you don't really have to knit that end of time, but otherwise it's really important. And in the coding world, we do a similar thing called prototyping, in fact. And prototyping, has a lot of purposes, but is where you construct a small piece of software that you run, and or you pre-build out something you're planning to build later, and then you test it out in the world. And you want to try and find, does it have market fit? Maybe that's your prototype. Or maybe you test out the code and try to determine whether it's going to scale or if it's going to accomplish that complicated algorithm you're trying to solve. So prototyping in knitting is called gauge swatching. And in most cases, but not all, you throw out the thing at the end. You get rid of it. Maybe in knitting you might rip it out and reuse the yarn if you're real conservative. I've definitely done that. All too often in coding do we push the prototype to prod and want to scale that thing, when really we should completely refactor or just tear away the important bits. Did you have a question? No. Okay. Sorry. It's okay. Just check. So, swatch. You might also consider the gauge swatch to be the hello world of knitting. So for those of you who aren't familiar with coding, hello world is a simple program that when run displays the message hello world. Fittingly, it's also belonged in new programmers' induction into the myriad of programming languages. In fact, there is a compilation site of knitting called the Hello World Collection at helloworldcollection.de, which you can check out, where they have coding Hello World programs of all the different programming languages in multiple human languages as well across the world. It's really kind of fascinating. So one that I pulled off from there is actually called KPL, which is Kids Programming Language. I hadn't heard of it either. It's very similar to BASIC. So again, this is a programming language. And this one is actually writing out 99 bottles of beer, which is a fun little program. So some things I want to point out to you, because we're going to get a little more nitty-gritty into the code here, similarities. It has a program definition, so this is the 99 bottles of beer program. There's a method declaration. We're defining some things. We've got a while loop action going on here, and different function definitions. So a bunch of stuff. So I know for the knitters, you're like, yeah, I don't understand this, but coders are like, yep, that looks like it's going to tell me how much beer is left. Great. Yes, good. So what this maps to in knitting patterns are, I find a lot of similarities with, so it's like variable declaration. So in knitting, this is a knitting pattern. Okay, this is one I took or wrote, not sure. Oh no, I wrote this one, okay. So we have, again, that defined structure. So this is defining some of the things we've talked about with the tools, but it also has this little hint here, directions. Oh, that might be where something starts executing, I don't know. Begin increase, that could be a subroutine or a little module of knitting. There's a lot of cool catching on. All right. So I'm asserting here that a programming language is a formal language which comprises a set of instructions that produces various kinds of output. Programming languages are used in computer programming to implement algorithms, and most programming languages consist of instructions for computers. Now, knitting patterns have instructions for humans, right? Knitters, as it were, producing various kinds of output, various different things that you get, and their set of instructions. Starting to get there. All right, so we're going to dig in a little bit more. This is, again, knitting pattern. This is a very common thing in a knitting pattern, if you're lucky, that it will specify the abbreviation section or the glossary section. But there's a lot going on in here, actually, lots of hints. So we have our little binary operators that have now been abbreviated. So K stands for knit, and P stands for purl. Now, for those of you who don't knit, and you're like, yeah, I know about the knit. What's this Purl thing? I know the language Purl, but no, it's different. It's the reason it's the binary opposite of the knit. They're actually mirror stitches. So on this might blow some knitters' minds, but on one side of the fabric, a knit stitch, when you turn it around, becomes a purl. It's kind of like that 0 and 1 thing. Very binary, true, false. Okay. So we have other different abbreviations here, just to make things a little shorter. We'll talk about that, different stitches. We even have a little mini function definition going on here, some syntax definition. The thing about knitting patterns is they are not as consistent with code, but similarly to different programming languages that have different syntax, so do knitting patterns. So it's helpful when the knitting pattern writer specifies how they're abbreviating things or indicating different repeats. Turns out knitting patterns are really dry. So dry means do not repeat yourself. It's a best practice in the coding world, mostly. And so essentially, knitting patterns might say 25, and that means knit each of the next 5 stitches. It's just a much shorter way of putting it. And it's much clearer than writing, hey. Yeah, that's hard to parse as the human implementer. You know, similarly, when interpreting code, computers have they're abbreviating things. Here's a little Ruby for you, though, of how you might write out K5. So for those coders in there. Stitching. So knitting patterns are like programming languages, and we want to reduce our instructions to their simplest, most logical form in order to avoid redundancy, promote efficiency, and reduce the potential for glitches to occur. And we're talking about knitting patterns still. You follow me there? Okay, yes, reducing some constructions, kind of sounds like compiling. You might have been reminded of regular expressions, regex. They are special notation that kind of indicate how many times things should be repeated. Ooh, let's look at this knitting pattern for a second. So here we have this definition of a seed stitch. So it's a particular kind of stitch. It looks, I don't know here. It's bumpy, I'll tell you that much. And what we have is this row 1 definition, where you knit 1, purl 1. Remember, we're abbreviating things. And this stands for repeat from the star. So then I go back, and I'm going to keep executing across the row like this. So this is what the human interpreter does with this line when they're knitting it. And then a new row, they start and they purl 1, knit 1, repeat. Okay? Here's another way to write this. That was what I was just saying about the different syntax. There's a few ways to write it that are pretty common. And then to continue executing seed stitch, you keep repeating these 2 rows. So if we were to translate that to regular expressions, we might represent each repeat of knit 1, purl 1 regular expressions like this. A.k.a. Let's repeat it 10 times. Got the little brackets here. Not sure how that is to see. But now we want to talk about to the end of the row. How do we interpret that? Well, let's add a new line parameter. And the next row, we talked about row 2, purl 1, knit 1. So we've got pk, repeat 10 times, end line, new line. If we were to construct that into a 20-row repetition, we might say knit purl for 10, purl knit for 10, do that 20 times. Yeah, it's sounding really long, but it's a pretty typical amount of rows for maybe a scarf you're knitting. And then getting codey here, we might fill in some variables for different lengths, replacing 10 with X, 20 with Y, and clean it up a bit. And this is actually ribbing, which is a slightly different stitch than this, but it also down to a regex might look something like this. So representing knitting patterns in regex, kind of cool. One other thing we want to talk about is there's loops and counters. We have loops and counters in coding as well. These things that are not nearly this large are row counters in knitting. They're these very rudimentary little tools, but they're really helpful to help you keep track of what row you're on. Because as you saw in some of these patterns, counting the rows, so you're using counters as well, using variables to keep track of that. Loops. And loops are absolutely a thing in knitting. The very basic premise of a knit stitch is a loop, so to speak. But in knitting patterns, there's also looping. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's look at this example of a while loop in knitting. So while loops, for those non-coders, are instructions that are repeated until a condition is met. So usually you have some variable holding a value and you decrement it until it's equal to 0. This is a little snippet from hat decrease. So as you're knitting the hat, when you get to the crown of the head, you have to start decreasing the amount of stitches so that you can finish off the hat. So you will have to follow some instructions that might look like this. You're going to knit some stitches, doing this weird thing. This is a K2 tog, also known as knit 2 together. It's actually really easy. Same mechanism as a knit, but you do 2 stitches and they become 1. Very exciting. Knitting also has increases that go the other way, but and then you continue, and since you decreased, essentially you have less stitches, less total in your row after that, then the count decreases, and so you can kind of track this. K10 becomes K9, becomes K8, and you keep going down until you have no more to knit together. And then you finish a hat. So another call out between coding and knitting is there's a lot of reuse, right? We talked about those design patterns kind of having similar structures, and similarly in practice, there's a lot of copy paste. You know, I think most coders will admit that they are copying and pasting from another source. You know, you'll take it, you'll probably tweak it, Same thing happens in knitting patterns. You know, we're copying and pasting and just changing something slightly. In code, you know, there's a lot of boilerplate code or templated code where you're following something that someone else has already created, essentially, and copying it. And knitting patterns are actually usually composed of existing stitches. So somebody figured out how to do something that looked cool, and it was in a hat, you want it in your sweater. You can totally copy that over and knit it into a new one. So there's just, the differing is really just the ordering and the composition and how the things go together. The benefits, though, of the copy paste I just want to point out too are that, you know, it'll do something predictable. You're going to get something you already know is going to turn out. That's why we're borrowing code. That's like when we copy and paste code, it's because we don't want to spend the brain thought to reinvent the entire wheel. And ditto with knitting, you know, we want to know what it's going to turn out looking like. Former code might also, you know, already address the problem you're trying to solve, performance issues, somebody else looked at it, so it's kind of tried and true. So similarly to knitting patterns. It's also a good starting point for customization. So new things are created out of existing things in both knitting and coding. Debugging. I don't talk about debugging. Debugging and knitting. So knitters are actually really good at debugging patterns, because as I kind of alluded to before, they have a lot of mistakes. This quote's asserting there's a lot of knitters who are coders, so it's a regular part of knitting. So I'm telling you that too, that even if you don't code and you're a knitter, you could be. Even if you don't knit and you are a coder, you could be a knitter. So, I think I said that right. The notation is not always consistent, and some things just have mistakes. So as coders, we know this. We're really lucky to actually have linters and compilers and things that check it for us in our IDE. So that's where you're coding. Knitters not so lucky. The language is not as standardized amongst patterns, and it's harder to detect those mistakes. But so naturally, as we improve in our knitting skills, we have to get better at seeing those. And there's a lot of mapping that's happening to make sure. Sometimes the debugging isn't in the pattern, it's in you. I think coders can relate to that as well. Sometimes the error is between, what's that, the keyboard, and yeah, it's over here. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that knitting is not crochet. So let's revisit that briefly. I found this to be really awesome in terms of how crochet and knitting, a coding way of thinking about it. It's kind of like single-threaded versus multi-threaded. So, like I said, knitting uses a pair of needles to form loops, and they are moving across from one needle to the other. Crochet, however, and all of these stitches in knitting are considered live. Just hold on. Crochet, however, I don't have a live crochet thing going here, but is kind of the opposite, and there's only one, and it's just getting put right onto the piece. So in coding terms, the similarity is a single-threaded process. So it contains the execution of instructions in a single sequence versus a multi-threaded process that allows the execution of multiple parts of a program at the same time. So I'm saying in knitting, each loop is a part of the program. So there's multiple parts that are live at the same time. You can't drop one of these stitches off and kill it, it's very sad, without messing up your pattern. So again, multi-threading versus the single threading. I thought that was kind of mind-blowing. So back to this framework that I'm kind of talking about, we've sort of dug in now that both create product from specification or pattern using specific varied tools. They're building with an end user in mind. And yes, there's some specific configuration or skills and lingo, which involves some barrier to entry into both. If you noticed, I planted some knitting that was kind of started around the room. Maybe you didn't see it, but if you're not a knitter and you just walked up to that, could you just do it right away? Probably not. If I put a keyboard with half-code program in front of you that you weren't familiar with and just walked up to, you're probably not going to start coding it right away either. So there's a little barrier to entry there. It's not too bad. But now I hope that you're starting to kind of see the crossover between these two worlds, and that they might be more connected than you thought when you walked in this room. So another cool way they've actually met in the world is called Skynet, and this is where they made a neural net that made knitting patterns. So using kind of machine learning, and they programmed a bunch of knitting patterns into a program, and it came up with its own patterns on its own. So this is like some artificial intelligence for those non-coders familiar with that. And then they gave it to some knitters to knit and see what those computers came up with. What cool patterns are those computers programming for us? And some really wild stuff. I will publish this deck, and I highly recommend you check out this link for more of it. Really interesting. The cool thing about when the knitters went to knit those patterns that the computers had generated, they weren't totally straightforward. They didn't all make sense and translate well into things that could actually be knit. So the knitters had to do some debugging and figure out how to create it. But they were determined, and they made some really cool stuff. So this Skynet was super awesome. I also love knitting and coding. As I mentioned, I've been doing both for a while. I created my own business called Astraknots, which incorporates astrology into knitting. And so I wrote a Python program that took an astrology chart and turned it into a knitting pattern. And then I knit it. And I had to do a lot of debugging as well, in both the program and the knitting. So that was fun. And turn it into this scarf. So this is an astrology chart turned into a knitting pattern and then knit by me. So pretty fun. The buttons are the planets and their placements and the different colors of yarn. The blue was specific parts of the pattern, and it's a little hard to tell from back there, but there's all sorts of different patterns going on here. So just another fun way how they kind of translate. And then there's this. So this has been pretty interesting topic lately, and I hinted at this at the beginning, but there's, yes, a gender split in knitting versus coding. So 71% of knitters and crocheters are female, meanwhile, 78% of programmers tend to be male. Interesting. My hope is that we can bring these two worlds together, because as I've just been describing to you, there's a lot of similarities between them. So there's more that we need to do here. So first, let's talk about some challenges that specifically women are facing. I recently read this book. It's called Brave, Not Perfect by Reshma Sujani, and she is the founder and CEO of Girls Who Code, which is a nonprofit organization which aims to support and increase the number of women in computer science. The part of this book that really jumped out to me was a story about girls who were learning to code, and they would attempt to write a program, and they would make a mistake, or they wouldn't get it right, and then they would delete the whole file. I was like, and it was crazy. And they were really close maybe to the solution, but they would just delete the whole thing. It was quite a struggle, like, well, what's going on here? Why are they just giving up? And a light bulb went off in my head. So, like I mentioned, I've been teaching knitting for a long time, and yes, I teach mostly women, but not all. There's some men I've taught to knit as well. And I noticed that I've always thought of some knitters as perfectionist knitters. I was just like, oh, that's okay. But I would send students home and say, okay, continue knitting this thing or whatever, and they'd come back and they'd say, oh, well, I had to rip it out like 3 or 4 times. Or sometimes they would just like, oh, I got stuck and I totally gave up. I was like, wow, that is so similar to this story that Reshma was talking about in this book, where girls just stop and give up because they're seeking that perfection and to accomplish it. So I actually developed a class to teach people how to solve their mistakes in knitting, and I encourage them to just knit through it. So that's like our new motto. Just knit through it. I was like, you're gonna make a mistake. Everyone makes a mistake learning to knit. It's challenging, and you just have to keep going and just keep knitting. And we'll talk about those mistakes later. We'll teach you how to fix it, but you can't just stop or give up. I have a lot of people that come to me for knitting help, and they totally stuck dead in their tracks when they make mistakes. They just can't move past it. And I found it really fascinating when I read about that there's a similarity there. So definitely a problem. But for those of you who have tried knitting before and maybe gave up because you thought it was a struggle, just knit through it. Just keep going. You know. Similarly, in coding lands, when we're learning how to code and learning it, we have to keep just retrying, and work through those errors. So, another cool story about knitting I wanted to throw out and kind of speaks to the gender gap. There's this woman, Sue Montgomery. She was a city councilor and mayor in Montreal. She did this little experiment, not sure if you've heard about this, where she would knit in red when men were speaking, and in green when women were speaking. And in the city council, there was pretty close to gender equality, like a balance in men and women. So that was kind of interesting. I liked using knitting to kind of highlight some of these issues. I recently attended the Develop Denver conference here in Denver, another great conference, and one presentation review some statistics about mental health in the coding industry. So transitioning to mental health now, and how so many coders actually have a lot of stress, anxiety, and depression that they're suffering from. A really high number, even though they rated their lives as awesome, like in the survey. It was really, really fascinating, but kind of concerningly high number that were suffering from that. And what I realized when thinking about this crossover between knitting and coding was that knitting has all of these health benefits. And knitting actually is great for anxiety and depression, things like chronic pain relief. We've got a bunch of lists. So low blood pressure, slower onset of dementia, an increased sense of well-being, reduced loneliness and isolation, gives you a sense of pride. People feel that when coding. I always coach my coder people who are learning that there's this, like, you either feel like it's the God dog principle, you either feel like you totally nailed it and you can do anything, or you know nothing at all. And it's really just those two states that you click between. I've experienced similar things with knitting and in teaching people to knit. They tend to be in one of those states, oh my God, I'm so proud I did this. Oh, I totally suck, I can't do it at all. So one of those things. But you know, knitting has all of these things. It actually helps prevent arthritis and tendinitis. I know a lot of people are asking me about carpal tunnel. You gotta still do your stretches, but it alleviates symptoms of anxiety, stress, and depression. So we could actually treat some issues that we have in the coding community with the health benefits of knitting. Also, concentration. I've talked to a lot of people, really helps their focus. I know it's very meditative for me. I can't live without it. So lots of health benefits there. So, you know, if you have a friend that is a knitter, maybe introduce them to coding bootcamp. No. So I'm going to wrap up here and give you some key takeaways to take with you. Knitting and coding are similar. Translating between them could help us close the gender gap in tech. Might be good for health. Help address this. I think there's a lot of mental health issues. There's a lot of organizations that are nonprofit that are helping, you know, vets and people with PTSD with knitting. So it's got lots of really great applications there. And finally, I want you to walk away realizing the world isn't binary, actually. We kind of lazily believe that things are one way or the other. So try to build a habit of how you can kind of see more of that overlap in areas that you used to think there was no way to tread into. And, you know, embrace a Quizlet value and teach yourself something new. So that's an action item I have for you. And if you don't know how to knit, you know a knitting teacher now. And if you don't know how to code, there's lots of great resources to learn. You can be self-taught or you can take classes. There's lots of different approaches here. Definitely want to key in on that diversity aspect. That's a big part of Denver Startup Week, and I think the Denver community in general. You know, so introduce yourself to someone here that you don't know or someone who doesn't like you. But yeah, if you make mistakes while learning, And I didn't say learning to knit or code or anything, but in any learning is hard sometimes. You make mistakes, just knit through it. Well, I'm Genevieve Krzeminski. Please follow me at Astraknots as well as at Quizlet. You can access the slide deck with lots of the links and stuff with that bit.ly link up there, and go to my speaker deck. So if you want to check out more of those things, then I got sources reference everything here. So thank you very much. I will touch this.